The Daleks have been an iconic part of Doctor Who for a long time, created to mirror the Nazi threat of World War II by comedy writer Terry Nation, and they made Doctor Who a success, and they continue to play a part in Doctor Who to this day, and have become iconic. Yesterday I began my ranking of all 24 Dalek stories from worst to best, covering places 24 to 13. So be sure to check out that video if you haven't already. Today I'll be covering places 12 to 1, as I rank some of the very best Dalek stories in Doctor Who history. Be sure to remember this is all subjective, and my opinion, this does only include the Daleks' appearances on the TV show and does not include cameo appearances, and I've excluded both Mission to the Unknown and Army of Ghosts and Doomsday. But without any further delay, let's continue with the list, with number 12. I know a lot of fans really hated this story, but I think it's actually a rather underrated story. I think what really works about it is that it highlights the Daleks as Nazis and fascists through the World War II setting. Terry Nation initially based the Daleks upon Nazis, but seeing them in the setting which they're originally based upon makes the threat more relevant and more fitting, and means those parallels have more impact. We have the Daleks manipulating and tricking Churchill into using them against the Nazis. I think Winston Churchill makes for a great historical guest character. Not only does he have a great sense of history and genuine friendship with the Doctor, but he's also a flawed character, willing to use violence and desiring the Doctor's intellect and alien technology. He comes across as a character where the war has had an impact and taken a toll on him. He lives in a hopeless state where he is relied upon. He is tricked into believing the Daleks are the invention of a scientist named Bracewell, and this not only demonstrates that working with fascists always leads to death, as the Daleks ultimately betray him, but also shows the desperation the Nazis have put on him, hopelessly willing to ally himself with another group of fascists because of the desperation. And that desperation also mirrors the death and the disaster the Daleks can bring. The Daleks are shown as very cunning and clever, also using the historical period in turning the lights off across London to allow humanity to destroy itself in war, and using Bracewell as a bomb, as a weapon. It's a simple story about the Daleks rebuilding their race. Also, I know many fans hate them, but I really like the Paradigm Daleks. They're one of my favourite Dalek designs. The colours bring a sense of hierarchy, and they are very tall and imposing, and the Dalek Supreme has a lot of threat. That being said, although they are very cunning, they largely play an exposition role, and they could have played much more of a sufficient role in the story to show themselves as a force to be reckoned with. The Paradigm Daleks are too reliant on future stories to show their evil, and unfortunately the backlash as the show almost immediately disposed of them means they are much of a missed opportunity. I feel bad putting this story so low because it is a classic Dalek story, but I prefer all the stories above it. Although it's certainly a strong and entertaining story, and the Daleks prove to be a strong threat, there are stories that have improved upon the Dalek invasion formula, and made better stories as a result. But the Dalek invasion of Earth takes the success of the first Dalek story and utilises the threat of the Daleks for an Earth invasion, posing them as a threat to humanity. We have a dark and dystopian future as the Earth was infected by plague and surrounded by death, and by the time the scientists were able to act, it was too late, rather similar to our current world. And the Daleks used this as an opportunity to invade humanity. And I think that's a rather effective and captivating and dark backstory, and the story draws strong parallels with the Nazi threat of World War II, more than the first Dalek story. The imagery of the Daleks surrounding and patrolling London is truly iconic and powerful and captivating, with Barbara trying to escape, and their tanked look draws obvious parallels, and the cliffhanger to episode 1 of showing the Dalek emerge from the River Thames is great as well, showing the constant struggle of humanity who are strong to survive as they attempt to fight back to gain their freedom. The oppressed nature of the freedom fighters parallels Britain in the war, and I think the Robomen as robotised humans becoming servants of the Daleks brings appropriate threat and tragedy, having had all their humanity and all their freedom taken away, simply become slaves of the Daleks. I also think the story is a very good departure for Susan, as she develops a connection, a liking, and mutual attraction to David over the story, and you root for their relationship as Susan has to learn to let go of the Doctor, and finally grow up, as the Doctor's speech at the end is very touching, as he learns to let go of his granddaughter for the benefit of her own growth and development, allowing her to grow and become her own person. There are just a few things letting the story down though. First of all, it is overlong. There is a lot of padding with a lot of obstacles, such as the scene in the sewers, and Ian facing an unthreatening slither creature. I think it could have been cut down by a few episodes. And although it has some strong guest characters, most of them lack character development. But the main thing that doesn't elevate it to be one of the best Dalek stories is the Daleks' main plan of digging into the centre of the Earth to replace the core of the Earth with a power drive so they can pilot Earth anywhere in the universe. It just sounds like a ludicrous and silly plot device, and the logistics sound unbelievable, and I don't see the point of it, or why the Daleks want to do it in terms of motives. But it doesn't massively derail the story, because the Daleks' oppression of humanity keeps their threat intact. I don't like this story as much as a lot of fans do, but it's still a Dalek story that's a lot of fun. I think the main appeal is seeing the spin-off shows with Torchwood and the Sarah Jane Adventures all converge into Doctor Who. It's still a good story if you've only watched Doctor Who, but it's all the more rewarding if you've seen all the spin-off shows, as well as seeing Captain Jack and Torchwood, Sarah Jane, Rose, Jackie and Mickey, and even Harriet Jones, Unit, the Jadoon, and the Shadow Proclamation having appearances, all working against Davros and the Daleks. We have some fantastic moments in this story with the Doctor reuniting with Rose, and the rather shocking cliffhanger of his regeneration, which I feel is resolved in a satisfying way. And Donna's end is incredibly tragic and one of the best companion exits. But the reason I haven't put this story any higher is because there are a number of fundamental issues with the story that does diminish it at some level. Rose sitting down with a human version of the Doctor, for me, does diminish the tragedy of her exit, and I feel the human Doctor being born in blood and anger is over-exaggerated, as if he didn't take action, the Daleks would have destroyed all of reality. We also have the fact that, similar to Dalek invasion of Earth, the Daleks' plan makes no sense. They want to destroy all of reality, but it's never verified if there's any way of refining their power. So surely the Daleks would also be killed from the reality bomb, making their whole plan pointless. It's death for the sake of death, and the Daleks are not gaining power or control in any way. they are destroying themselves, which is a rather vital flaw. In a weaker story, this may have broken the whole thing, but like Dalek Invasion of Earth, because it's so entertaining to watch with so many highlights and moments, I'm willing to overlook it. I don't think this story gets the credit and appreciation it deserves. Overall, I've not been a fan of the 13th Doctor era, but I think Chris Chibnall has proved to be genuinely great at writing Daleks. It's proven to be a strength of his that should be acknowledged, and I think this story revives the Daleks after almost a decade of very much going downhill. It takes a lot of elements from previous Dalek stories, but it's repackaged in ideas and strengths that we haven't seen before, and therefore feels refreshing and new. The best thing this story did was to strip down the story just to one Dalek trying to take control of Earth. Armies of Daleks aren't threatening if we don't know the havoc and the consequences of one Dalek and what it can cause. So, like Dalek, Chris Chibnall takes one Dalek and shows its evil. But what I like is the effort to show the evil of the Dalek creature and demonstrate the Daleks as an evil mutant alien, as we see the Dalek vulnerable and separated from its casing, but still show it as the most dangerous creature in the universe. We see the Dalek take control of Lynn and take away her freedom and her choices, and take control of her body, and use it to mercilessly kill anyone in its path, in its battle for superiority and power, as it retrieves its weapon and rebuilds its shell. When we see the Dalek back in its casing, it's a very satisfying moment, but it's earned and more dangerous because we know of the damage and the harm which the Dalek can do, and the history and the legacy of this Dalek add to a lot of the depth, with humanity having rebelled against it and being buried on Earth in separate parts ever since the 9th century. The scene of the Dalek facing off against the army shows it as a merciless and dangerous war machine, as does the scene where it takes control of GCHQ. I think the relationship and depth of history between the Doctor and the Dalek also has a lot of appropriate focus in this story, and the story has a lot of depth and character drama. The relationship between Lynn and Mitch is one you root for, and makes you feel more sympathy for Lynn when she's under control of the Dalek. I just feel it would have been great to have some tragic consequences if she died. And I really like the exploration of the relationship between Ryan and his dad, and Ryan's abandonment issues, learning to forgive his dad. And it gives the ending a lot of weight, and the death of Grace with Ryan, Graham and Aaron obviously still holds a lot of presence in the story. It's not a perfect story, it's held back by the Dalek being rather easily defeated by a microwave, which is very much shoehorned in and forced into the story in an annoying way, and the Wi-Fi gag simply is one of the most cringy moments in all of Doctor Who. But this story is exactly what the Daleks needed, a story showing them as powerful villains. The original Dalek story comes at number 8 on this list, which proves even after coming up to 60 years, the Daleks is still a threatening and sinister story that shows the Daleks as a true threat and introduces them into the Doctor Who universe rather effectively. They are what made Doctor Who a success. I love the first episode of wandering through the forests of Skaro and the Dalek city, wondering what might be lurking in the corner. It has a sinister scare factor, and the Dalek plunger coming out to attack Barbara as the cliffhanger to episode 1 is truly terrifying. We see the Doctor and the companions put a true threat in this story, with the Doctor, Susan, Ian and Barbara being prisoners of the Daleks, and slowly dying of radiation poisoning, which means Susan has to step in, giving her the chance to show a more brave side to her character and exposing her struggle and vulnerability. But the Daleks are truly cruel in this story, but also cunning, manipulative, and merciless. Their design and bellowing persona mirrors the Nazi threat of World War II, and them being forced to retreat into these physical shells with limited movements due to an atomic war mirrors the threat of the time of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War in a very effective way, as well as their mentality and motives of wanting to destroy anything unlike them, mirroring the threat of the Nazis and keeping a real threat from 20 years earlier alive and scarier than ever. The story promotes a very positive message though, as Ian persuades the Thals it would be wrong to let themselves be destroyed in trying to maintain their pacifist ways, showing that it's good to show values of peace, but they are of no use if you won't stand against evil when the time comes. There's some true highlights in this story with the Daleks cruelly manipulating the Thals, telling them they will help them, only to try and kill them. Susan facing the perils of the Forest of Skaro, just to try and save the lives of her friends and the Doctor and the companions, working against the Daleks and working to help escape as Ian hides inside a Dalek. It's a story that defined the Daleks, but it does become tiresome towards the second half of the story, with a lot of pacing issues as it drags on too long with underdeveloped characters and with a whole episode dedicated to the Thals venturing to the Dalek city and trying to move past a number of different obstacles, but it fails to be a compelling drama, and I think out of the 7 episodes, they could have easily cut 2 episodes out. But it's one of my most rewatched Dalek stories, as I always enjoy the threat and the struggle of the characters, but its length does hinder it somewhat from progressing further on this list. The Ninth Doctor's final story was certainly a great exit for him, and similarly a great story for the Daleks as well. Very much like the 1960s, as we feel the Daleks' threat because of the already built and established threat. We have seen the threat of one Dalek, and therefore when we see thousands of them, we understand the impact of that and what it means, and the havoc they could unleash. This story shows not everywhere the Doctor visits is benefited because of him, and it allows the Doctor to face the consequences of his actions. I love how the Daleks' return is handled, and the cliffhanger to Bad Wolf is one of the best cliffhangers in the show's history. We also have the return of the Emperor Dalek, having a real climactic presence, and a great design, and acting as a god of all Daleks. As the Daleks are very much portrayed as an extremist religion, where anyone who goes against their beliefs is a traitor. I love the idea of Daleks created through the main remains of humanity, which only makes them more dangerous, driven mad by their lack of purity, which highlights their racial ideology. The racism of the Daleks is further tackled by their need to wipe out anything which is not Dalek, and does not resemble their view on purity, by wiping out all the innocent lives on Floor Zero. I think this is a truly emotional ending for the Ninth Doctor, faced with a great moral dilemma. The Ninth Doctor has been personified by his grief over destroying his own race at the end of the Time War. His conflict in this story parallels that, as he has adopted Earth as his second home, but now he has to make the decision whether he is willing to sacrifice humanity to defeat the Daleks. With all the blood on the Doctor's conscience, he has to make the decision if he wants to be a warrior or a doctor, as he decides to be a doctor. As when Rose saves him, he sacrificed himself just to save her life. It's a simplistic story, but one of great emotional depth, where the Daleks are at their best. But believe it or not, I think there are stories that handle them better. A 7-part story where only one episode remains, and yet it's still one of the very best Dalek stories, and in my opinion, still holds up as a classic. I will admit it has some pacing issues, but it's still one of the best. This one really tackles the purity and the principles of the Daleks in their ideology. It starts out with a lot of intrigue with the Doctor and Jamie trying to figure out why a character called Edward Waterfield has stolen the Tardis, and why he's taken antiques from the Victorian era to sell in the 20th century. It's great that he appears as a villain, but actually turns out to be a rather conflicted character. A character who is vulnerable with empathy, just trying to protect his daughter, with clear guilt and concern for the evil he's contributing to, and being forced to go against his principles. We also have Maxwell, who's a great villain willing to betray his friends for the progress of science, and for his own benefit, cluelessly working with the Daleks. It's also great to see the Doctor, Waterfield and his partner Maxwell being forced to work together to identify the human factor to implant in the Daleks. Seeing the Doctor forced to manipulate Jamie and make him think that he has betrayed him shows the manipulative side to his persona in what he's forced to do. I think this story is defined by how the Daleks are utilised though, and the themes explored. We see the Doctor create more human Daleks that behave like children, who have names, and play games. This is a lot of fun, but it goes against the principles of the Daleks. But it turns out the human factor allowed the Daleks to identify the Dalek factor, which they intend to spread across all of time and space. This represents the short-sighted and paranoid nature of the Daleks, and their superiority in their beliefs, not only being unwilling to accept anyone unlike them, but attempting to enforce the Daleks' need to conquer and obey throughout the universe. We see the first appearance of the Dalek Emperor as he comes across as a force of power and menace. But it's great to see the Doctor manipulate the Daleks, as we have a Dalek revolution, with the Daleks with the human factor learning to question their regime and turning against their leader and oppressors, showing the spirit and value of humanity. This was intended as the Daleks' end on Doctor Who, and whilst I'm glad they returned to the show, this would have been a very fitting end, as it's a great, epic conclusion. The second Doctor's first story, and yet it's rather an ambitious story, with a lot of complexity for the introduction of a new Doctor, in the very first Regeneration story. But in a way, that's what sells Patrick Troughton in the role, with his ability to show his fear of the Daleks, an understanding of their evil in that nobody else understands, and his frustration in that nobody has listened to him. But after the Daleks' master plan, it would have been difficult for the Daleks to get any more ambitious in scale, and therefore, the Daleks are made to feel more intimate, sinister, and scary, as they rebuild their race. It's set on a human colony on the planet Vulcan with a scientist called Lesterson, who sees the potential in the Dalek technology revolutionising the colony, as he gives the Daleks life, as the Daleks manipulate humanity and act as their servants, only to control humanity and build their own strength and rebuild their race. The Daleks in this story are shown to be clever and intelligent, as the scene and cliffhanger of seeing them rebuild their race with producing the new Dalek mutants as they are placed in the Dalek casings is the highlight of the story, where we discover their true motives. The death and tragedy at the end as they attempt to destroy all life on the colony shows the sheer ruthlessness of their mentality. But the story also has rather compelling political conflict, with Bragan becoming power hungry and trying to establish his own regime, and willing to resort to deceit and murder for his own power. Bragan is a very corrupt character, establishing martial law, attempting to take freedom away from the people. It's a clear mirror of a fascist mindset. A character determined to carry out his own agenda and determined to ensure the obedience of the people. And the Daleks represent the ultimate warning of the ultimate price of fascism at its very gravest and most dangerous, as the colony's willingness to tolerate the Daleks and to tolerate the Nazi mentality is ultimately what leads to such death and disaster. It's a great story that shows the sheer ruthlessness of the Daleks, which is why it's so high on this list. This is a true highlight of Doctor Who and of all the Dalek stories. After many years of Davros sidelining the Daleks finally get central focus. We have a story that has a lot of fan service, and certainly rewards fans and long-time viewers in meaningful ways, but it doesn't take away from the story being told and very much ties into it in a way that makes sense, returning to Totter's Yard and Coal Hill School. We see the Doctor return to settle unfinished business from when he was the first Doctor and left the Hand of Omega behind, which two Dalek factions are now after. I love seeing the Doctor come back with a purpose. The Seventh Doctor is actively fighting evil, unlike a lot of the other Doctors, who tend to run into trouble, and it's a quality I love about him. We also see him manipulating events and people on a chessboard to his own advantage in a very clever way. The story plays with Time Lord mythology, but simply uses it as a MacGuffin and plot device. This story manages to give the Daleks a hierarchy with the Dalek battle computer, using a child for the purposes of imagination, fooling the audience into thinking Davros is in the chair, but the little girl cleverly turns an innocent girl into a scary presence. And we also have the Special Weapons Dalek. I love the Special Weapons Dalek. It's my favourite Dalek and proves to be a force of great firepower. The Daleks are very powerful machines of war in this story, going up against each other, and the cliffhanger to episode 1 is fantastic, with the first time seeing the Daleks tackling the stairs. We have a fun set of characters with the countermeasures team. We also have the Daleks set at a very relevant time in 1963, a war based on the racism between two Dalek factions, with one set of Daleks believing the others to be impure. It brings a lot of variety to the Dalek storyline. It also offers some powerful social commentary on the racism of the 1960s, taking place in the civil rights movement, with Mr. Radcliffe allying himself with the renegade Daleks as a fascist and white supremacist who believes Britain should have allied themselves with the Nazis, very reminiscent of the beliefs of the white power movement and fear of immigration of the 1960s, justifying itself with the bigoted desire to protect their country. It's a story that presents racism in all forms and shows it must be continued to be fought, but tells its story through a great science fiction storyline in a great and fun alien invasion storyline with the Daleks. We also have a great appearance from Davros as the Emperor Dalek, who has now become more Dalek than human, becoming more and more like the Daleks. And the Doctor makes a ruthless decision to destroy Skaro, wary of the consequences of his actions. Incredible story, and my second favourite story in the history of Doctor Who. So why is it only at number 3? Well, as a Dalek story, it can't be as high as it would be judging it as a story overall, because the Daleks have a lack of presence in the story, and there is a sufficient lack of Dalek action. I think it's for understandable reasons, because it's all about the origins and genesis of the Daleks, but although it doesn't mean all the other elements of the story are irrelevant, I am putting more value in how the Daleks are handled and treated, which is why I do feel like there are a couple of other stories above it. That being said, there is a reason this is known as a classic, and there is a good reason why this is known as Terry Nation's best script. The war between the Thals and the Khaleds is very compelling, having been going on for centuries and generations, where the two of them have run out of resources, and they've forgotten why they were fighting the war in the first place. The Khaleds appropriately mirror the Nazi attitudes of superiority and power, believing they are genetically superior to all other life forms and rejecting them. Davros is also appropriately scarred and injured as an immoral scientist, which gives him a great dynamic and relationship with the Doctor, and this truly is one of Tom Baker's best performances in the role. Davros is cruel and cold and calculated, with a warped sense of mentality and a warped morality, believing it's impossible for races to work together. But a very fearful racism and fear of other races, having no good reason to believe that. We have a great cast, with Nydia being a very cold and calculated character as Davros' right-hand man, with a lot of other great guest characters like Garman and Ronson, who play well into the political conflict of the story. It's a story with some of the most compelling drama in the entire history of the show, as the scene when the Doctor questions whether he has the right to destroy the Daleks and what that will turn him into is one of the most compelling scenes in the show's history, one to be played and performed by Tom Baker. I did a full in-depth review of this story earlier last year, so if you want to check it out, feel free. But it's a morally complex story with a lot of conflict for the Doctor. It's quite an achievement that a story that's mostly lost has earned the number 2 spot on this list, as well as the longest story in Doctor Who's history if you count the Trial of the Time Lord as 4 separate stories, as I do. But there's a reason this story has such a high reputation and why I feel it's still strong to this day, and the best of the 1960s Dalek stories. In the early Heartland adventures, we see the threat of the Daleks built up. We've seen them oppress the Thals on Skaro, we've seen them invade Earth and oppress humanity, chase the Doctor across the universe and battle the mechanoids. The Daleks have proved themselves as a threat and as ruthless killing machines across several stories, and therefore it's a fitting time to show them as a superior threat and to take them across the universe to claim their superiority and dominance, mirroring the scope of the Nazi ambitions as well. I enjoy seeing the Daleks working together with different species and races to try and take over the universe, use them for their own devices, only for later in the story to dispose of them. Mavic Chen, played by Kevin Stoney, despite the questionable racism of the period, I think is a very strong villain with a lot of authority and power, clearly deluded, believing that the Daleks are relying upon him, and unaware they are plotting to dispose of him, but he's clearly very power-hungry. I like seeing the Doctor and Stephen running across the universe trying to stop the Daleks and prevent them from unleashing the Time Destructor and causing devastation. It works a lot better than in the chase as it's spread over 12 episodes with mostly neutral environments with more stakes and motives for the characters and villains and more of a chance to flesh out the environments and locations. I do think that episode 7, The Feast of Stephen, is a terrible episode, unnecessarily slotted in a Christmas special in the middle of an epic adventure which distracts from the central storyline. But the other 11 episodes are great. We have fantastic characters with Brett Vian, played by Nicholas Courtney, who would later go on to play the Brigadier, proving to be a very authoritative ally with a lot of loyalty and a lot of conviction and presence. And I really like Sarah Kingdom and her chemistry and relationship with the Doctor and Stephen, with some very strong character growth as well, as a very sufficient, ruthless character with a lot of empathy. But it's also great fun to see the return of the Meddling monk. This is a story of death and tragedy, and shows the consequences of the Doctor's lives, with the death of Katerina, Brett Vian, and particularly Sarah Kingdom, leaving a clear impact on the Doctor and Stephen. It shows the consequences of the Doctor's life, as they both remark upon the wasted life. Whilst Genesis of the Daleks is my favourite story to feature the Daleks, I think Dalek is the best story to handle the Daleks the best. I may be biased as this was my first Dalek story I ever saw, but I think it shows the Daleks at their most threatening and dangerous, and gives them more emotional depth as well, which is something that's rather difficult to do. The Daleks became a pop culture icon at this point, but had largely been turned into a joke in the 1980s and 90s. But Dalek tackles very specific critiques that have been levelled at Daleks over the years. We see the Dalek once again tackle the stairs, which had largely been forgotten, use their plunger to kill, and also use as a tool to get out of prison and absorb information from the internet, using it to search for the Daleks. We see the Dalek as a merciless creature of war, with no compassion, methodically killing any living thing that stands in its way, and determined to wipe out anything which is not Dalek, despite having lost its empire and being the last of its kind. It's the Nazi mentality at its most extreme in the hands of one Dalek. But we also see the Dalek as clever and cunning, showing its loneliness in order to manipulate Rose into showing compassion so it can escape. Intelligent, just as the Daleks were in the 1960s. The story uses the basic Based on the Siege format, but uses it to give the Daleks more depth. The Doctor and the Dalek are both survivors of a war. They are both the last of their kind, and have a loneliness weighing on our shoulders. We feel a level of sympathy for the Dalek, but there is an anger in the relationship between the Doctor and the Dalek. This relationship has developed into one of fear and hatred since remembrance of the Daleks. The Daleks fill the Doctor with a lot of pain, guilt, and resentment because of the Time War. The Doctor wouldn't hesitate to kill the creature with no mercy. The story questions if the Doctor is indeed going down the same path of his most hated enemy, by being consumed by his hatred of the Dalek and so willing to kill. But the Dalek is contaminated by human emotions through its interaction with Rose. We see the Dalek feel compassion, being unwilling to kill Rose and Van Statten. It is disgusted by itself. The Dalek ends up killing itself, commits suicide, because it would rather die than live as an impure Dalek, capable of love and compassion. It explores the twisted ideology of the Dalek in a rather meaningful way that makes you feel sympathy, fear, and resentment. It's not only the best Dalek story, but it's the Dalek story where the Doctor began to realise what he was becoming. Through Rose, began to fall back in love with humanity again, and decided to become a Doctor. So that's my ranking of all the TV Dalek stories, from worst to best. Through 24 stories, the Daleks have made a huge impact on the Doctor, from his first encounter with them in the Daleks, the Doctor being sent to destroy them in Genesis of the Daleks, the Doctor fighting against them in the Time War. They've become one of the Doctor's greatest enemies, and will continue to impact the Doctor in dreadful ways as long as the show continues. There have been some great Dalek stories. I'm sure there are many more great Dalek stories to look forward to in the future.